When I was first applying to software jobs, I absolutely hated every part of the process. In that first job search, it took me 600 applications to get my first job. The process of getting a software job, from applying to studying for interviews to interviewing, is a painful process. In this video, I wanted to cover why everyone hates applying to software jobs. I'm going to go through the annoying process of finding and submitting applications, the mental toll of interview prep, and go through the experiences of one person who applied to 250 jobs to see exactly why it is so frustrating. So the first part about why aspiring software engineers hate applying to software jobs so much is the massive amount of variance in how complicated it is to apply to jobs. Because in theory, it should be incredibly simple. You just submit your resume, you put your name down, your phone number, and you're done. But that is not even close to how it works. A large chunk of these applications are extremely clunky to use. And if you ask why, the simple answer is ATS. So what is ATS? ATS stands for Applicant Tracking System, and a majority of companies will use some form of ATS to manage their applicants. Basically, it's there to make the lives of hiring managers and recruiters easier by either parsing through their resumes, finding keywords, filtering people out, and keeping track of candidates through the interview process. Because without this, companies would need teams and teams of recruiters in order to track everything by hand. So it seems reasonable enough why companies would want to use it. The problem is that there are many different ATS options out there, and all of them vary in their level of complication. Some of them can take a very small amount of time to apply to a job, and some of them can take a grossly large amount of time. And to help explain this, I bring forth this article that I was reading recently. This guy applied to 250 jobs and tracked his progress through all of them in order to show why they were so painful. He actually mentioned that he was going to apply to 500 jobs in order to make this article, but he stopped halfway through because he wanted to chop his head off, which is extremely relatable. And what he found was pretty interesting. First of all, there are a handful of ATS, and in his research, he encountered about 8 different types. To start, the worst offender when it came to ATS was Workday, which not only requires you to create an account for every application you want to apply to, it also tells you to re-enter all kinds of information that already exists on your resume. The average application time was 251 seconds, the worst of any system. But there are good systems, like Greenhouse, which is a much simpler application system that only asks for your resume and a few other details and takes an average time of 55 seconds to apply to a job. And what he also found was that the average application time for a company depended heavily on either what industry it was in and the company size itself. Government and aerospace companies came in at the worst possible application times. And more modern cutting-edge industries like cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence came in as the quickest. He also had a chart that shows in general, depending on the company size, generally there's a correlation between the more employees that a company has and the amount of application time it takes. This is usually because big companies have more compliance and more rules and more things you need to do in order to apply for their companies. So as you can see, the process of applying to jobs is tedious and it could vary widely amongst every single company you apply to. And the inconsistency really causes people to hate the process. And really, this is only step 1. Next, we move on to one of the worst parts of the whole process, the abyss of actually interviewing for software jobs. So even after you go through the process of applying for jobs, well, now you have to pass these interviews. So let's dive deep into why people hate software interviews so much. First of all, at least in my experience, the amount of rounds of interviewing you have to go through at any particular company varies wildly. The interview process could be as short as a single phone call and then an on-site interview. But some companies, you could have a phone call with a recruiter, followed by a coding test, followed by a take-home assignment, followed by a phone screen where you have to do technical problems, followed by an on-site screen for 5 hours amongst multiple engineers, and potentially follow-up interviews and assessments and everything like that, which equates to probably tens of hours of time you've poured into interviewing at one company. Again, from my experience, generally, the length of the interview is correlated to the size of the company itself, with smaller companies usually having shorter interview processes and larger companies usually having longer interview processes. And the lack of being able to know how long a process will be means a lot of preparation and time invested into a single company that could just be a waste. It's understandable why companies want to make the hiring process difficult because it limits them hiring false positives, but it's no doubt that the long cycles can be tough on the applicants and contributes to why this process is so emotionally and physically exhausting. Speaking of which, we move on to the next part of the interview process, which is the interview prep. Interviewing in software is hard, and it can take months to get good at this. To interview these days, you need to be good at coding and you need to be good at doing these software engineering interview questions, which is essentially its own skill set outside of coding. This is where most people have gripes with the industry as a whole, because most of the time these interviews involve being asked questions that won't be really used on the day-to-day job, but are only there to weed out candidates during the job search process. And it makes people ask themselves repeatedly all the time, why am I studying these questions if they're never going to be used on the job? And during technical interviews, you have to code on a whiteboard, you have to code on your computer, you have to draw out diagrams, you have to do all this while an interviewer is breaking apart your solutions left and right. And all this can be incredibly stressful. And for me, going into an interview the first time was a stressful experience as well, because it was awkward. I made all kinds of different social flubs and mistakes, and I said things wrong all the time. And there's no real getting around the fact that if you're not good at interviewing, if you're not good at talking to people, you're just gonna have to fail a whole bunch of these interviews before you can be really competent at all. So we've covered a lot, but now we move on to something that can be maybe the most painful part of the whole process, the rejection. Rejection from software jobs can be incredibly impersonal and frustrating. Ghosting is probably a term that you heard from dating, where once two people have started to see each other, they started going out, one person suddenly, for some reason, decides to drop off the face of the earth, never to be seen again, just disappears. It doesn't really feel good for the person that is dropped, and it can lead to feelings of frustration, anger, and confusion. In software interviews, imagine after this entire process, applying for a job, talking to recruiters, preparing for an interview, going through different rounds of a phone screen over and over and over again, traveling to an on-site office. After all that, you get ghosted, or you get a very impersonal email that you are not a good fit for the company. This too is unfortunately very common in the software industry, and it again really doesn't feel great for the applicants. Another aspect of the opaque hiring process is the lack of transparency. After an interview, a lot of companies don't really provide clear timelines on when an interviewee can expect an answer or an update, or how even the review decision works behind deciding if you are the right fit for the company. Every company has their own rubric and way they evaluate these potential software engineers, and you'll never know what it looks like unless you are on the other side of the table. And worse yet, most companies won't provide any feedback on your interview experience. A lot of the time because of liability concerns. They don't want to give too much feedback. They don't want to tell you what you did wrong because it could open them up for lawsuits. Understandable, but again, doesn't feel great for the engineers. So this was a lot of information, but hopefully it highlights why people hate applying for software jobs so much. If you like this video about the difficulty of applying to software jobs, you might want to check out this other video on why everyone is struggling to get a software job these days. Thanks for watching.